Sounds good.
Okay then, so you're in Germany, in Berlin. I'm in a little village in the northwest of England, which has lots of industrial towns around it, and the current incidence of COVID-19 is very high here because of the industrial part of some of the towns. But Germany's had a very different kind of experience. So at what point did you go back home?
So I went home mid-March, around the 13th of March, I think. So 10 days before the UK lockdown started.
So I think it must have been about the 12th of March that I saw you. I saw you coming out of a building and I kind of vaguely waved. But that was the point at which I went into lockdown on the following day because I have an autoimmune problem.
Okay, I see. So you moved back to the northeast of England, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. My main home is here in the northwest of England, in this little village, and my working home is in the centre of Edinburgh. So I was lucky enough to be here when the lockdown happened, or I'd have been in a flat with a view of a car park and nothing else. So Germany's had a very different experience of this thing we call the pandemic. I mean, have you got a sense of what it might have been like in Britain? Or do you see things very firmly through the lens of the German experience?
I mean, obviously, having been here since basically the lockdown started, I'm predominantly sort of facing the German situation, but I'm obviously also following, media coverage. I have lots of friends, PhD students over in the UK. But sort of comparing, I think, the different sort of experiences of this virus, I think, especially when it comes to the before, I think, that sort of different temporal and infrastructural and socio-political conditions. So, for example, I think when it comes to the future, I think Germany did not face, as the UK was facing Brexit at the end of the year, but Germany was moving sort of, stable. I think we have sort of very different infrastructural sort of preconditions. I mean, I guess you have heard about this. We have quite well-functioning healthcare systems, and we have, sort of trust into our leaders. We have with Angela Merkel, we have a very experienced leader who also led us through the financial crisis. She's very much trusted. I think we have a different setup politically because our country isn't as centralized.
Yes.
We have this federal system. So I guess responsibility is naturally shared. And of course, we also have sort of different.
So you identified these political differences. And if you remember, I did offer to swap Boris Johnson for Angela Merkel.
Yeah.
I think you would have got a deal, perhaps not a very good deal, but we would have certainly got a much better deal because apart from anything else, he's a very inexperienced politician in the sense of having a responsibility for something. So you've identified the sort of political circumstances. Do you think they've been the most important factor in producing different experiences, or do you think the shape of the pandemic has had something to do with it?
No, I do think that sort of the political factors are quite important in our case. And I do think I think before, this long-term leadership with Angela Merkel, this sort of, I guess, very stable public health system, the sort of the realization that you can rely on the state when it comes to crises. And I guess just a general sense of solidarity. And I think Germans, I mean, this might sound a bit, generalizing, but I think Germans are quite rule following. So I guess when someone says you got to do this to protect the community, I think most Germans would at least do so, and then only afterwards, as we can see right now, sort of go on the streets and protest and fight the the rule.
Yes, it's been very noticeable that other countries too are much more rule following. That Sweden said social distance is sensible, so people did it. Say social distancing is sensible in Britain, and people flock to hug each other and crowd in public places, as though they're immune. So I think there are kind of like national characteristics that are involved. But you mentioned after. I mean, you've got a big awakening coming because the safety of a very experienced political leader will go. And there will also be wider reverberations around Europe. I mean, both within the EU and within Europe geographically and politically. I mean, so do you have a sense, both as you, Nicolas, and also as a sociologist, about what you're after in Germany might look like?
Yes, I think on the one hand, I'm a bit worried because I can see, people right now, protesting on the streets, and I can see, not only conspiracy theorists, but also, right-wing nationalists sort of mixing together and honestly and really fundamentally challenging the authority of the state and fundamentally challenging democracy and drawing some very interesting comparisons with, back during the Nazi time. At the same time, as we could see yesterday, there's this sort of recognition that Germany's future is, ultimately about Europe and the European Union. And I think this was, quite obvious yesterday when Macron and Merkel proposed this 500 billion EU rescue fund.
Yeah.
I have sort of mixed feelings, but generally I'm still optimistic.
I mean, one of the things that I think is very different is that a large part of a generation in Britain has died very, very quickly. And so in terms of social structural factors, there are things about the population and how the population is structured. And when schools in Britain open up, please, the prognostications about children having some kind of immunity from the worst experiences of the virus are right, because otherwise the possibility is, like in 1918, all around the world, a generation of young people will go. That's what happened in 1918. The young and the old died. Well, and lots of people in the middle died as well, but disproportionately. So we have the spectacle in Britain of this age shape to the virus currently, but whether that will continue depends upon ideas about expertise and science, and whether they're right about who has immunity from the worst effects or whether they're wrong, and only time will tell.
Yeah.
What about? I mean, maybe again, this is something about the specificity of the horrors of what's been happening in Britain. But do you have a sense that things could be very different? I mean, one of the things I was thinking of is that paradoxically, we have this inept conservative government, but it's cured homelessness. There have been no homelessness people roaming the streets. It's cured poverty. It's demonstrated very, very clearly that with political will, there will be no homelessness, bar a very, very tiny number of people, and there will be no absolute poverty. I mean, that's a big thing to take in, and I wonder whether that will impact on political possibilities and the political landscape in Britain subsequently. Do you have a sense of there being anything like that in Germany?
So first of all, I agree. I think it was absolutely astonishing to see how quickly sort of money and finance was sort of mobilized, and how quickly political leaders were actually able to act. But when it comes to things like fundamentally changed after, I have mixed feelings. I'm not convinced that there will be fundamental changes. I think there is sort of an acceleration of futures, if you want to call it like that. I mean, we can see these rapid innovations, this rapid digitization happening in the healthcare system, happening also in academia, I guess. So I guess there's sort of acceleration of futures, so futures brought into the present. At the same time, I don't think that there will be fundamental changes. I'm sort of skeptical when it comes to challenging global narratives such as capitalism or globalization.
There's very interesting things about positive emotions. I mean, I don't think political leaders change in and of their own volition. But I think, the valuing of people who do shit work, the people who do care work, the people who do low-paid jobs like empty refuse bins. I think people's perception of what is the moral worth has changed in an important way. So I think there might be some kind of political movement from below about wages and about political strategies and about what is the best way to treat groups of workers. I mean, in the wake of Brexit, it's very instructive, isn't it, that most of these heroes of the National Health Service and the heroes of the care sector are actually from all over the world. They're not just from Britain. And I think huge numbers of people in Britain have not been aware of how much the labour market and our well-being depends upon those people.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's a similar action in Germany. I think there's a recognition of these, systemic inequalities, and there's an urgency to improve, for example, essential workers' living conditions, working conditions. So on that, I completely agree. I think there's definitely some sort of momentum going on. At the same time, no.
No, I mean, so the kind of acceleration of things already in motion, you think, will outweigh these kinds of much more emotive ground level responses, so that it will be pretty much business as usual, but with some changes already underway being accelerated by what's happened.
Yeah, I think sort of what this crisis has shown is that sort of very sort of overly abstract futures have sort of entered the present. So I think two examples are quite illustrative. I mean, of course, we could think about the care workers, we think about sort of the people keeping the economy and the society running. But for example, I think climate change, I think, is another topic which is quite interesting. When you see these pollution graphics in China and India, and you see these very gray landscapes, and then only with this crisis we see these fully green landscapes. So all of a sudden, this very abstract future, climate change emergency, is sort of injected into the present, and people can actually relate to it. When you think about the urban experience, I think we also see that there's a return of nature. Yes. Right? There are animals sort of coming back into the urban landscape. There are different forms of interaction, right? We talk about neighbor solidarity. There are also, I think, novel forms of sort of sensorial experiences, right? So the city smells differently. You hear different things, right? So I think we are confronted with very abstract futures, and we see sort of possibilities when we think about climate change, when you think about essential workers, when you think about experiences of the urban.
So do you think the social theory that exists on futures still stands up, or do you think there are now question marks over some of its ideas and its conceptualizations of what futures might be like?
I do think so. I think it's actually more important than ever. I think it's extremely important that sort of decision makers engage with the future, or engage with futures in general, and think, actors such as Covid-19, especially non-human political actors such as Covid-19, sort of inject this fundamental uncertainty into decision making. Yes. And so I think there's two main implications here, right? I think it's important to actually develop an understanding of what we mean by the future, right? Is it an open space? Is it pre-structured? Do we conceive as futures of sort of having only one single possible trajectory? Are futures perceived as coming towards us, or are we actually able to, create, and do we have some agency here? And I think there's also a second implication, an epistemological implication, in the sense of how can we know about futures? And I'm doing research on expectations, right? And so I think when we look at expectation and anticipation, I think we can sort of really grasp futures. And I think, so to answer your question, I think, yes, social theory on the future still very much holds up, and I think will become even more important.
A friend of mine who's a social historian is South African's expert on plagues and pandemics, and did a very, very good book on plagues and pandemics in South Africa. And he dates them from the arrival of Europeans and colonialism. In a European context, of course, eyes turned towards the Black Death in the 14th century, where a huge proportion of populations died. Something similar happened in 1918. The calculations are somewhere between 200 million and 500 million people died. And a lot of what you've referred to already a lot of those political events were impacted by that huge shift in population structure, the collapse of economies, the rise of the spectre of starvation and other illnesses, not just the flu and influenza, but also measles and a number of other epidemic diseases as well. In a sense, do you think, I mean, it seems to me we are at a particular point and people in Britain are behaving as though it's over. The experience of past pandemics is that there's a second and a third wave, and something as intractable as the coronavirus is not going to go away. It will shift and change, and the virus will continue, like HIV and AIDS. If there is that decimation of the population, what do you think might happen? And would those ideas that you sketched out about sociology, writing and conceptualizing futures still hold up? I mean, imagine a third of the population in Germany dies, a third, across all age groups.
I think there's this sort of we're talking about this new normal. I think sort of what this pandemic has shown us, that there's an inherent degree of uncertainty and there are things we just can't control. Yes. I think we have to get used to the fact that these very uncertain contingent events increasingly shape our everyday lives. So, for example, thinking about the new normal, I think the new normal is the old normal, but our perception has changed. So I think we will have to get used to this new normal. And so at the same time, I do have belief in progress and in innovation. And I do think that we are actually able to, harness this uncertainty and deal with, this immediate threat. So I don't think that we will, at this point, I don't think we will face, an extinction or, record numbers of deaths. I think we are able to sort of adapt. But I think what's quite important is that we sort of include uncertainty in our decision-making processes, that we think with uncertainty. And so I think this will actually allow us to also from a sociological point of view, really, deal constructively with the future.
So the kind of sociological imagination that presently deals with uncertainty are the interactional sociologies. They're not the structural sociologies, which deal in sort of vast certainties of the slow wheels of social structure that move very, very slowly. At an interactional level, all of these complexities and responses to uncertainty are things that not in the same way as COVID-19, but in small terms, we have to deal with uncertainties in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
Do you think what's happening is going to have an effect on the kinds of sociology that people see as more able to conceptualize and work with these uncertainties of the future?
Yeah, I think I have two sort of remarks on this. I think it's important to sort of, I guess, transcend the structure agency divide. I think it's important to recognize the future as a sort of, unit of analysis, as a conceptual space, which has to be included in sociological thought. I think it's important to also avoid, because I guess the future is quite slippery, right? And people can't really make sense of it. Therefore, sometimes it seems that it's empirically very hard to sort of grasp. I think one way to sort of, avoid this slippery nature is to actually focus on the process of futuring. And I think
we have the rise of Norbert Elias. I mean, in my mind, the one sociologist of the post-1945 period who transcends the structure agency divide, who is firmly fixed on process and how processes produce a series of futures, is Norbert Elias. So I hope you're right, and we see much more interest in those kinds of social theorists and researchers who are grappling with such things.
No, I think it's really important to look at the process, and I think another sort of aspect that seems quite important to me is to open up to right, and to sort of transcend this, I guess, dominant focus on human interaction. And this is very much in line with Donald Mackenzie and A&T, but I think he and others make a very good point by saying that we have to recognize, non-human actors such as COVID as powerful political forces, right? Because this very abstract, this invisible virus is shaping society.
Sure, but there is a limit to that, and witnessed by our conversation about differences between Germany and Britain and Sweden, etc. That non-human factors may be involved, but they're not deterministic, and they're mediated by history and culture, and by this thing that we referred to as a kind of national character. Or sort of inbuilt national responses due to particular configurations of structures and ideas about beliefs and values. So I'm not entirely sold on that argument. I would go part of the way towards it, but it would be interesting for us to return to this conversation at some point. And I think maybe this is the point at which we thank each other very much for a very interesting conversation, and maybe we might continue it when we're a ways down the road and we know a bit more about whether there's going to be a second and a third wave of the coronavirus epidemic.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you very much, Nicolas. Cheers then. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.